Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Katie. I am the outreach librarian for the NOAA Central Library, and we are hosting the third and final of our EndNote trainings for NOAA exclusively. We will, of course, have more EndNote trainings in the future, but for now, we're going to end our beginner, intermediate, and expert run with our expert training and our expert trainer, Jimmy McCullery. Just as a reminder, we're recording this, so if you do miss it or if you need to hop away and come back at a different time, this will be up on the library's seminar page under our training tab. I'll make sure I put that in the chat. You are muted, so you need to put any questions or comments you have into your question panel, and we'll get those. We'll try and answer questions at the end because Jimmy has a lot of content to get through. And so with that, I am going to stop talking and turn it over to Jimmy.
Thank you very much, Katie, and good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's private expert features in EndNote 20 class for NOAA. Thanks for joining me. As Katie mentioned, we've got a high-paced lesson plan in store for us today, so I'd like to just jump right in. And as Katie mentioned, our session is being recorded. So, if possible, I'd suggest just following along on screen as I'm showing some of these tips and tricks in EndNote 20, and then using that video recording to go step by step in your copy of EndNote if you'd like to reproduce some of these workflows on your computer. Most of you probably have met me in the two previous sessions, but just quickly for anyone who might be joining this session anew, my name is Jimmy McCullery, Digital Education Specialist here at Clarivate. I work from the San Francisco Bay Area. I've been with the EndNote team for quite some time, starting in the customer care department back in 2000. I joined the product support team in 2001, where I spent most of my tenure supporting EndNote and several other programs over the years. I jumped at an opportunity to join Clarivate's digital education team mid-2018, and now I primarily focus on developing EndNote training materials. However, I also lead EndNote training sessions for both public and private audiences like this session today, and I feel honored to have assisted so many researchers in preparing their projects for publication. Now, there's a link to a PDF class handout in the GoToMeeting webinar, but if you'd prefer just to read along, I've got our primary learning objectives on a couple of slides that I'd like to cover before we dive in. Attendees of this particular lesson plan should be able to demonstrate expert level knowledge required to master some of the more powerful EndNote features such as library syncing and library sharing and workflows for customizing reference formatting. Today we're going to start by creating a free EndNote Online account via the EndNote Online website. EndNote Online is a standalone solution that you can use if you don't have access to EndNote Desktop, but if you do have access to EndNote Desktop, such as EndNote version 20 that we'll be chatting about today, you can utilize EndNote Online to synchronize references in an EndNote library so that you can access them on more than one workstation, and so that you can share them with other team members. With EndNote 20, you can create a library sharing team of up to 400 sharees. I want to talk a little bit about when it might be advantageous to use multiple EndNote libraries, the best practices around sort of library creation or management. There are a couple of features in EndNote that are built around the approach of storing everything in one EndNote library. So again, I'd like to point out that distinction and give you some tips and tricks with regard to, again, managing and organizing your EndNote libraries. With the EndNote sync feature, you can choose one particular EndNote library to synchronize with EndNote Online so that you can access your references via the web or on another machine. Typically, an EndNote license would allow you to install on several computers. You might have a desktop and a laptop where you're working with EndNote, and instead of manually moving your library back and forth between a couple of computers, you can set up the sync feature in EndNote 20, and EndNote will automatically coordinate the contents of that library between your workstations for you. So today I'd like to show you how you can set up EndNote sync from scratch, and then I'd sort of like to mimic what it would look like to set up sync on a secondary computer. Of course, I can't change workstations midstream today, but I'll sort of point out that point in our lesson plan and sort of, again, show you what it looks like to set up sync on a second or third device. Once you've set up that synced library, that's when you can choose to share your library, again, with up to 400 other EndNote desktop users. So I'd like to show you how you can set up a library sharing team. I'd like to show the flip side of that coin, what it would look like if someone has sent you a library sharing invitation and how you would access that shared library. If you might not want to share your entire EndNote library with someone else, or maybe your sharee doesn't have access to EndNote desktop, you can also share individual custom groups from your synced library with other EndNote online users. So again, in addition to setting up a library sharing team, I'm also going to walk you through setting up a group sharing team, again, so that you can share just a portion of your library or share with colleagues who might not have access to EndNote desktop. And then I'll point out some of those differences between syncing and sharing and what's included. We'll look at access or assessing and modifying access rights for library sharees and group sharees. When you choose to share library content with others, you can give some of your team members read-only access if they just need to be able to search and cite from that shared group or that shared library. But if you have other colleagues or teammates who need to be able to make changes to your library, you can give those persons read and write access, and they can do almost anything you can do in your shared library. So that's a great collaboration tool. As part of the library sharing process, there's an element in EndNote 20 called the activity feed, where you can monitor changes that are made to your EndNote library. So from the activity feed, you can see 500 of the most recent changes made. There's a timestamp of, at what time that change was made, on what day. There's a name associated with it, so you get an idea of, who introduced that change to the library. So again, a great sort of audit trail that you have access to when you're sharing library in EndNote 20. Then we'll shift gears, talk a little bit about some EndNote preferences. With EndNote Desktop, you have the ability to apply a sort of a personalized 5-star rating system to your library references. This feature is not enabled by default, but it's something that you can quickly turn on by just changing a drop-down menu. So I'd like to show you those preferences today. Then we'll also talk from EndNote's preferences, also talk about what are called reference types, which are the different types of materials that you would store in an EndNote library. There are dozens of predefined reference types in EndNote, but you can customize those existing reference types. You can create brand new reference types if you'd like, and these modifications are shareable. So once you've made changes to your reference types, you can export those changes to an XML file to share with others, and a team member can just import those changes right in their copy of EndNote and see the same field names and reference type names that you might have customized. So that's a great collaboration tool as well. And then we'll close out with a couple of global edit features in EndNote. We'll look at a find and replace tool, pretty common feature, in software. But if you ever have, multiple references where you've got a term or a phrase or a name that you want to change without modifying each individual reference, you can achieve that with find and replace. A little bit of a more powerful global editing tool is called change, move, copy fields. And with this global edit function, you can do things like change capitalization in a field. You can erase a field if there might be a piece of information you don't care to keep track of. You can tell it to completely erase that field in your library. You can move data from one field to another. You can copy data from one field to another. So I'd like to show that in action as well. And then we'll close out quickly with how you can download EndNote output styles from the web, or perhaps an output style that a colleague has sent to you, either via email or a shared network drive or a sync service. And you can, once you've received that style file, you can incorporate that in your copy of EndNote so that you can apply the same formatting guidelines to your research projects as your teammates might be. With that said, everything else we'll be looking at today is in our in the application. We do have a couple of closing slides we will return to, but I'm going to go ahead and minimize our slideshow here, our PowerPoint slideshow, and go ahead and close out of our other applications as well. Now you can see I've already got EndNote 20 up and running on my computer here, and I've got a library open, pretty basic. And essentially we're going to start with this library, and we're going to set up that sync feature. Now with EndNote Desktop, like I was mentioning, you do have the ability to make separate libraries for different projects or focus areas in your field of study. But we do recommend, if possible, storing all of all of your materials or all of your literature in a single EndNote library. Within one EndNote library, you can store 1 million references. So essentially 999,995 references per library. I say it's virtually unlimited. I've never spoken to any user who's actually hit that upper size limit, but I did want to point that out. And within each EndNote library, you can create 5,000 groups and group sets, which are these sort of elements of your EndNote library that allow you to add an extra level of organization, so that within a single EndNote library, you can have completely separate sets of references for different projects or focus areas, quickly accessible by just clicking on a particular group or group set name. So again, if possible, we do recommend storing everything in one library, but there are certain roles in research where you might be working with multiple authors, multiple doctors, multiple collaborators, where it just might not be possible to store everything in a single EndNote library. So again, it really comes down to personal preference with regard to how you take that approach. But when it comes to library syncing and sharing, like I mentioned, you would have to pick one primary library that you're using for these actions. So today we've got an example library open called My Research Projects, a pretty basic library with a couple of group sets, a couple dozen references in it, just so that it quickly syncs. And we're going to, with this EndNote library, coordinate the contents of this library with our EndNote Online account. Now, I've already got a browser open here. I'm just going to return to Mozilla Firefox. And if you want to access the EndNote Online website, there are a couple of ways to do that. Probably one of the easiest methods would be to just visit endnote.com, as we are here today. And you can see there's a link right at the top of the page called EndNote Online Login. If you're to click on that, that takes you to the EndNote Online Login page. Alternately, you can navigate directly to myendnoteweb.com. It's all one word, myendnoteweb.com. If we go ahead and just load that here, you'll see that the login page is a little bit of a longer URL that, of course, is more difficult to memorize. And I didn't know I was actually logged in here. Let me just log out once more. There we go. So that's the login URL. So I usually recommend, if you're going to navigate directly to this page, it's just myendnoteweb.com. From here, you can create a free EndNote Online account. Pretty much almost anyone in the world can make a free EndNote Online account, even if they don't have access to EndNote Desktop. It would be what we call an EndNote Basic account. It's very limited in terms of its features and functionality, but you, as the name implies, you can get a pretty basic research paper done. So again, almost anyone in the world, if you don't have a free EndNote Online account just yet, you can click to register here, and it will just, the system will ask for a couple of details related to yourself, an email address, a preferred password. You do have the ability, when you create an EndNote Online account, to link it to a Facebook or LinkedIn account to streamline the login process from the web. But I did just want to point out, if you create an EndNote Online account and link it to either of these services, your EndNote Online account still has an underlying email address and password that you'll need to retain for when you're logging into the system from Microsoft Word or EndNote 20. So again, this might not be something you choose to set up, but I do like to mention that, again, if you create an EndNote Online account and link your EndNote Online account to either Facebook or LinkedIn, please just be sure that you jot down that underlying email address and password, because you'll need those credentials elsewhere. Now, of course, I've already got an account. I'm not going to log in from scratch. I'm just going to go ahead and use my stored credentials here. And once we're logged in, this is going to be the web interface for EndNote Online. You don't have all of the bells and whistles as you have an EndNote Desktop, but it's really handy, if you're away from any of your computers where you've installed EndNote 20. So long as you've set up that sync feature, you can access all of your library information, your file attachments, your custom groups right from the web. You can make changes to your references here, and those changes would sync down to EndNote Desktop as well. Now, I just want to point out, we have 10 references here already in the web in our EndNote Online account. We have a custom group called Online References. These aren't yet part of our desktop library, but I wanted to add a couple of items ahead of time to show you how sync is a two-way street. So now that we've logged in, we've sort of reviewed the account creation process, the login site. I'm going to leave the page up, but we're going to go back over to EndNote 20 where we've got that desktop library open, and we're ready to now to sync this library. And like I mentioned, once you've picked the library that you want to synchronize with EndNote Online, make sure it's open. It's not a bad idea to back up the library beforehand just in case. You can back up an EndNote library at any point from the file menu through a command called compress library. But due to time constraints, we're going to skip that step. We'll go right to the library drop-down menu here in EndNote 20, where you have a sync command. I'm going to go ahead and click on that now. So when you click on sync, you'll get a login prompt the first time. If you don't yet have an EndNote Online account, you can actually sign up for an account directly from this prompt as well. So again, if you haven't from a web browser gone to myendnoteweb.com to create an account, you can actually just press sign up here and walk through that process as well. We're going to go and just input those same credentials that we used from the web, so long as I remember my password here. Let's see. All right. Now that we've got those credentials in place, we'll press OK. And EndNote, the first time you sync, it automatically suggests backing it up. I always like to manually preempt that prompt by choosing that compress library command from the file dropdown. But again, even if you don't do that ahead of time, you will get a chance to back up your library. But again, due to time constraints, I'm going to go and just press no here. And we're going to see that the sync is taking place. If you keep an eye on our group structure here, you might notice that that online references group already came down and it's receiving the references, those 10 references that were part of it, and everything else in this desktop library is synchronizing up to EndNote Online. So just to reiterate, sync is a two-way street. Anything in your desktop library gets uploaded to EndNote Online and vice versa. Anything that might already exist in EndNote Online will come down and become part of the desktop library. After setting up sync, you can click sync status at any time. This window lets you know if sync is actively taking place, and it'll also show some details related to your sync status, as the name implies. We see those came up right now. If there was a sync error for whatever reason, that would be displayed here. Those details are helpful for EndNote product support to help figure out what's going on and what might be holding up a complete sync from taking place. You also have some statistics related to your local library, how many references, groups, and attachments. Same goes for your online library. This also helps to ensure that a complete sync is taking place. Now, if we go back to the EndNote Online site just for a moment here in Mozilla Firefox, I need to refresh the page since it was already open after we set up the sync feature. So if we just go ahead and reload here, all right, we see that we've got far more references. All 142 references are now available in the cloud. We see all of our custom groups from the library. Any file attachments, any PDF attachments are accessible here. So if we're away from our computer, we can access these library details. If you have an iPad or an iPhone, there's a free EndNote app for those devices. And that EndNote app acts as an extension of your synced library so that you can, access all of these same references, file attachments, your custom groups. You can, from the iPad or iPhone, you can annotate PDFs, you can capture new references, and anything that you add from those devices will sync back up to EndNote Online here. And when you return to EndNote 20, you'll have access to those same changes as well. So again, sync, you never really have to access your synced library from the web. This is something that it's just enabled, or you're empowered to do so by setting up the sync feature if you wish. Now, like I mentioned, once you've set up that sync feature on the first computer, this is something, if you use EndNote on more than one computer, you might want to set up on a secondary device as well. So I quickly just want to mimic that at this point. I can't change computers right now, but let's go ahead and let's close this library here. And I'd actually like to just quickly reset my sync preferences to get it to look a little bit more similar to what it would look like for you if you're setting up sync on a second computer. So let's pretend again that we were on our desktop computer where we had installed EndNote 20. We opened a library and we synced that with EndNote Online. We're now sort of pretending that we've now moved over to a laptop where we might have installed EndNote 20 as well. And you might think that setting up sync on a secondary device would start with you opening a copy of that library from the first computer. That's not the case. When you set up sync on a secondary device, whether it be a second or third, fourth computer even, you would start with a blank library. and then the initial sync that takes place, everything will copy down from EndNote Online to fully populate that new blank library. So again, if we're pretending we're on a secondary workstation, we can proceed by creating a new library. I'll click the link right here to create a new library. We want to save a library to our hard drive and give it a unique name. We can save it to any local folder that's not being synced by a third-party service. Like I mentioned, I would recommend that you give each sync library on each workstation a unique name. So we'll call this instance my sync library laptop, just as an example here. You don't have to explicitly name your libraries as such, but I think it's a good idea to do so. So once we've got a location set, I've got an EN libraries folder on my C drive. We've got our library name defined as well. We can press save. We'll have a new blank library on screen. Now that that's showing, we can go back to the library drop-down menu, select the sync command. We get that same login prompt, and again, on a secondary device, you will for certain have an EndNote Online account already. So here, we're just going to use those same credentials that we had used on that first computer. All right. And then once we've got that here, we'll see, as you can see already, all of the groups have already populated this new EndNote library. We're seeing the references streaming in here as well. And it just may take a little bit of time. It depends on how large that library is already. That sort of depends on how long that initial sync will take to complete. But once it's all done, and we can confirm that from sync status here, once it's all done, this library will look identical to the originating library in terms of groups, references, and file attachments. And it looks like the sync is just wrapping up. Perfect, that just finished here. All right, so again, we could have EndNote up and running on both devices, both computers at the same time. And EndNote, once every 15 minutes after you set up the sync feature, EndNote would check for changes that it needs to send or retrieve to or from EndNote Online. So this is a great tool to help you, work with EndNote on more than one device without having to manually move your library of references between those computers. And like I mentioned, once you set up the sync feature, that's when you have the ability to set up a library sharing team. So if you have any teammates, any colleagues that you want to share references with, whether it's maybe a one-time sharing action, maybe you just want to provide some resources to a colleague, or maybe you're both developing a research project together in Microsoft Word. There are different reasons why you might want to collaborate on the same set of references with co-authors. But for whatever the reason is, if you choose to set up a library sharing team, after opening up your synced library, you can go to the File drop-down menu in EndNote 20, and about halfway down is the Share command. I'll click on that here. And we see that, in our example library that we have open right now, we already have 2 library sharing team members. They've already accepted our invitation. So Anthony and Steve can both access this library on their computers. Like I mentioned, in EndNote 20.2, which is the most recent version of EndNote 20, you can have up to 400 library sharees. And so you've got a lot of flexibility in that regard. If we want to invite someone else to our shared library, we can just define their email address here. We'll go ahead and invite our colleague Peter to this EndNote library. So we just define Peter's email address right here on this window. As I had mentioned, each person you're sharing with, whether it be a group or a library, can be assigned a varying level of access rights. So again, if you have some sharees who just need to be able to search and cite from your library, you would want to give those persons read-only access so they can't mistakenly make a change. But if you do have colleagues or team members who you would like to give the ability to make changes, fix typos, add information, things like that, you can give those users read and write access. And again, they can do almost anything that you can do in the library. When you invite someone to a library sharing team, an email gets generated in which the recipient would have to accept that invitation. Now, it's very clear what the purpose of that message is, but if you'd like, you can add a personalized note to that email to add a little bit more context. But again, even if you don't add a message, it's very clear what the intent of the message is. I'm not going to add a personalized note here for Peter. I'm just going to go ahead and press invite. That's going to generate that invitation email that he'll receive. And your sharees will show up as pending until they receive that email and accept the invitation. So I did want to point out, for each library sharee, you can remove a person at any time, even after they've accepted the invitation. If someone is showing as pending and maybe they missed your invitation or it got picked up as a junk message, you can click the gear next to their name and remind them. That would just generate a follow-up sharing invitation email. You can change access rights on the fly. Even after someone has accepted your invitation, you can change their access rights to either restrict or elevate their access. And I did want to point out, if you remove someone or change access rights, that generates a separate follow-up message to that person to let them know, if you've removed them, that they no longer have access to the library, or if you've changed their access rights to expect a different level of access next time they open the library. So that's, again, what it looks like as a library sharer. This is the interface where you would add your sharees or remove sharees if you'd like. The flip side of this process, as I mentioned, if you're a library sharee, it's a little bit different. So I can't show my inbox in this message here, but ahead of time, I had received the library sharing invitation email. There's just a big accept button in that message, and you would click on that. Clicking accept takes you to an EndNote online login page where you just input your own EndNote online credentials, and that's what sort of finalizes the action of you joining that person's library sharing team. Once you've accepted that invitation, back in your copy of EndNote 20, you can go to the File drop-down menu, select Open Shared Library, and we see that we've got a list here that would show various owner email addresses. Now, I had mentioned that when you're a sharer of an EndNote library, you have to pick one particular library on your hard drive that you're syncing with EndNote Online and sharing with others. But as a library sharee, you could be a member of multiple sharing teams at once. So let's say you were collaborating on 5 different projects with 5 different teams, and one person from each team invited you to that team's library, shared library. In that scenario, after you accepted the 5 invitations, when you came to open a shared library, you would have 5 different owner email addresses listed here. And whichever library you would want to interact with, you would simply select that owner address. Whenever you're ready, you'll choose open. I just want to point out, I'm a sharee just on one library, just to keep things simple. But that's why we're just seeing one owner address here, but you can be a member of multiple sharing teams all at once. We've got our owner address selected. We'll choose open here. The initial sync of a shared library may take some time to complete. Again, depends on how large that library is. I had synced this ahead of time, so it finished very quickly. But just to point out, I'm going to resize this shared library to highlight the fact that in the background of the screen, I have my library open that I'm syncing with EndNote Online and sharing with a handful of others. In the forefront, I have someone else's library open that they've invited me to. I have read and write access, so I can make almost any change that the sharer can make to this library, but these are 2 completely separate containers of references. There's no interaction between the 2. Of course, you can copy and paste references from one library to another if you'd like, but that's really the only interaction between the 2. I just wanted to point that out. So here, if I resize the shared library, as a read and write sharee, pretty much the only thing that I can't do is change the sharing team. Only the owner of a shared library can add a sharee, remove a sharee, or change access rights. No sharee, even a read-write sharee, can change those elements of a sharing team. But here in this library, the shared library, I can see all of the references. I can open one of these entries. I can look at the reference panel to review all of the details here in the summary screen. I can see PDF attachments, and if I want, I can preview those here in EndNote itself. On the PDF preview tab. If that's a little bit too small, I can pop this out and open it in the standalone viewer here in EndNote 20. We see that that's displayed on screen. This was rebuilt from the ground up by our developers in EndNote 20 and has already proven to provide a more responsive reading experience. But aside from just reading these articles that everyone on the sharing team would have access to, here in EndNote 20, you have some annotation tools. So if you, from the PDF viewer, if you click this little icon to access the markup toolbar, You can do things like highlight text, you can underline text, you can strike out text, you can add searchable sticky notes. If you click this little speech bubble icon here, you can click somewhere on the page. It's almost like a digital post-it note, as the name implies. If you double click on that, it's a free text field where you can type a note to yourself or to a colleague. These sticky notes, all these annotations sync among a library sharing team so that you can, again, collaborate. It's a little bit of an extra level of collaboration in that regard. You can communicate with each other via sticky note if you'd like. I've just added the note to myself, interesting article. Once I'm ready, I can close the sticky note. If I'm all done reviewing the article, I can save those changes here. Won't say yes to save those changes. And we had talked a little bit about searching your EndNote library in the advanced level session, but I did just want to point out part of advanced search, if we expand that here, you have the ability, you can search, any field in your library, but if you wanted to search the sticky note text strictly, you have an option here called PDF notes. And then that way, if you select that as your field, only the text of sticky notes would show up in these searches here. So if I query interesting article, we see that there's a handful of references in this library that contain this this note. So again, you can communicate with a team of collaborators via sticky notes or other fields in your EndNote library if you'd like. It's really really handy. Now, like I mentioned, you have the ability to, as a read and write sharee, to make changes to the library. If you once you're in a excuse me, once you're in a shared library, if you go to sync status again, on the far right here, if I just move the go to meeting tab, just a moment, on the far right of sync status, we see this little bell icon with a little arrow. And if we click the arrow, this is that element that I called the activity feed. This is going to show you up to 500 of the most recent changes made to a shared library. Now, this is just an example library. We're seeing the term default user, again, just sort of a generic term, but in the real world, you would see a person's name, one of the sharees names here for each change made to a library, a shared library. You would see, on what day, at what time the change was made. The bolded elements on the activity feed are clickable and will actually show you the references pertaining to that change. So we see here, a little bit ago, we see that 139 attachments were added. And if we want to note, which references or which attachments were part of that change, we can click on that element and we see that it looks like a couple of the attachments have been deleted since the change was made, and EndNote lets you know. But the items that are still available are now displayed. We see a temporary activity feed group where EndNote is showing you those changes that pertain, the references that pertain to that particular change. So the one thing that you can't do or can't achieve is you can't undo a change from the activity feed. So if you share your library, I would recommend backing it up even more regularly than otherwise. And just to reiterate, at any point from the file menu, you can go to compressed library and make a complete snapshot of the library as it exists at that time. And they say the old adage is, if you make a backup, you'll never need it. It's when you don't make a backup that something always seems to go wrong. So it's not a bad idea to even back up as frequently as daily or weekly, just to ensure that you're not potentially risking any sort of data loss. Now, like I was mentioning, as a library sharee, those sharees have access to all references in your synced library, all file attachments, and all groups. Essentially, every element of your library is available to your library sharees. But if you want to share just a portion of your library with someone else, or you want to share with someone who doesn't have EndNote Desktop, you can, instead of setting up library sharing, you can utilize another workflow called group sharing instead. Now, group sharing still requires you set up that sync feature ahead of time. So just to reiterate, you would have to pick one particular library that it is that you're syncing with EndNote Online. And then once you've set up that sync feature, you could choose individual custom groups in your synced library to share. So let's say, let's close this is the shared library again that we have open. Let's go back to our original library in EndNote here. I'm just going to go and just close out of the shared library. There we go. We're back to our original library that we had synced ourselves with EndNote Online. And we had, just to reiterate, we had shared this library with a couple of colleagues. We had just sent an invitation to our colleague Peter, but if instead we wanted to maybe share with someone, again, who doesn't have access to EndNote Desktop, or for whatever reason we just want to share part of our library, we can set up a group sharing team instead. So the only groups that are shareable in EndNote Desktop are custom groups. Those are represented by the little inbox icon that we see here. Custom groups, this is something we discuss in the essentials level lesson, but essentially custom groups are the type of group you manually populate. So let's pretend maybe that my colleague Rick, let's say, needs to have access to these references in this to review group to help us help with this particular project. So after setting up the sync feature, instead of going to the file menu and selecting share, we can select a group, a custom group in our synced library. Once it's highlighted, we can right click on that custom group, and then we have an option here on the contextual menu to share the group. I'll go ahead and choose that now. We get a configuration window that looks very similar to the library sharing configuration screen, but here we're just defining the email address for our library sharees, or excuse me, our group sharees. And just as an example, we're sharing with our colleague Rick. And just like with library sharing, group sharees can be assigned varying levels of access. So if you have group sharees who just need to be able to search and cite from the group, be sure to give them read-only access so they can't make changes by mistake. But if you have others who you would like to collaborate to the contents of that group, you can give those persons read and write access. Now, like I mentioned, when you invite someone to a shared group, this is going to generate an invitation, an email, sort of an alert email to let them know that you shared the group. But unlike library sharing, group sharing does not require the sharee accepting the action. So like I mentioned, when you send a library sharing invitation, the sharee has to accept it first for them to be able to access that shared library in EndNote 20. But if you invite someone to a shared group, like I'll go ahead and do now, I'll click invite. This, like I mentioned, does generate an alert email to let them know that they have access to this group, but there's nothing else that they need to accept. Once you share a group with someone, it is just going to automatically show up in their instance of EndNote Online. So just to reiterate, we've invited Rick to our tour view group under hurricanes, and we've given Rick read and write access to the group itself. Just like with library sharing, you can remove a group sharee at any time. You can send them a follow-up alert email to let them know they've got access, or you can change access rights at any point. We'll go ahead and press close here, and I did just want to point out that once you set up your synced library in EndNote 20, if you have, if anyone else is sharing a group of references with you, you would see it, a shortcut to it here in EndNote Desktop. Now, I do have a group shared with me. I'm not sure why it is not showing here. I know that there was an EndNote Online update this morning, so perhaps there's something that's still in process in that regard. But to show you, if we go back to EndNote Online, I'll just return to Mozilla Firefox. Reload the page just to ensure it's showing all of the references here. Perfect. We see that in the side panel in our example account, we see that there's a heading called Groups Shared by Others. When you share a group with someone else, again, whether they're an EndNote Desktop user or strictly an EndNote Online user, they must access EndNote Online. They have to log into their account via EndNote Online, and that's where they would be able to interact with their shared group. So I'm, just as an example, I'm a sharee on a group called REM Sleep. I've just clicked on it here. This group has 50 references in it. This icon next to the group, it's a little bit abstract, but it looks like a silhouette of two persons and a pencil. The tooltip mentions that this indicates that I have read and write access to this shared group. So I can make changes to the details here if we wanted to. So these 50 references are not in my library, as you can see. They're in someone else's EndNote library, but because I've been granted access, I can see the details. If I click the title of any one of these references, I could actually make changes to the information that's stored, in any one of these references here, and these changes would be received by all other group sharees on this particular group. The one limitation to group sharing versus library sharing is that where library sharing includes file attachments, Group sharing does not. So returning to the REM sleep group, even if the sharer of this group had a PDF link to each one of these references, as a group sharee, I cannot see those attachments. So to reiterate, if you in your project that you're collaborating on, if you need to be able to share file attachments, library sharing will be the solution to achieve that. If there's no restriction or requirement to share attachments with your sharees, group sharing would be a perfectly acceptable solution. There's one other element that I want to show here related to shared groups, and that's if you're sharing a group of references with someone else and you're both going, or however many people are going to be collaborating on a Microsoft Word project together, there's one setting in EndNote Online that your sharee needs to change to be able to cite directly from your shared group. So again, we're sort of pretending that someone has shared a group of references with us, this REM sleep group. Now that we're in EndNote Online, if we want to be able to cite directly from this, we can point our mouse over Organize. We can click on Others Groups. And then I've already got it checked, but by default, Use for Cite While You Write will not be checked when someone shares a group. All you would have to do to be able to cite directly from a shared group is, again, access others groups here in EndNote Online and simply check this box. Once you do that, someone, again, in Microsoft Word that you're sharing with, they would be able to search for references right in your shared group to be able to cite directly in a project that you're developing together in Microsoft Word. So I did just want to point it out. And just to reiterate, because it's a little bit nebulous in terms of the differences here, library sharing includes all file attachments, all groups, all references, and you can share with up to 400 other EndNote desktop users. Group sharing, it's accessible. Instead of accessing it from EndNote desktop, you have to access a shared group via EndNote Online. Group sharing does not include file attachments. It's just the reference metadata. You can share with up to 1,000 sharees per shared group, and your sharees do not have to have an EndNote desktop license. They would just need to create a free EndNote Online account. So I hope that helps. And again, EndNote product support is always happy to help sort of give advice if you're looking to set up a library sharing team or a group sharing team to ensure you're sort of taking the correct approach to those actions. Okay, so just checking along here. So we've got about 20 minutes left. I think we'll be able to finish on time. I wanted to show you, again, a couple of EndNote preferences that are customizable here in EndNote Desktop. The first preference we're going to look at pertains to the display fields that you see in the reference list panel. So just to reiterate, your reference list panel is sort of the primary portion of your EndNote library. It's this sort of middle panel in the library interface where you can display up to 10 columns of information directly in the reference list panel, and you can quickly sort by any one of these columns here. A couple of ways you can customize these columns. Of course, you can resize them to personal preference. You can drag and drop them in differing positions if you prefer. But if you actually want to change the fields, the details that are displayed, or maybe customize the field labels, you can point your mouse over any one of the display labels here, the column labels, and you see there's a little gear icon that appears to the right. You can click on that. That takes you right to the display fields preference. But I did just want to point out you can also access this from the edit dropdown. That's where you'll find preferences here on Microsoft Windows. And then from this screen, if you go to display fields, again, you've got up to 10 columns that you can customize with regard to the details that are shown in your reference list panel. I had mentioned that I wanted to show you how you can set up a rating system in your EndNote library, sort of a subjective rating system. So here on display fields, you can set any one of the columns to be a rating. Let's go ahead and we'll just use column 7 since it's unused. We can click the field drop down. All of the various fields in our EndNote library are available. These are all of the default field names that we see here, but rating is near the top. We'll go ahead and click on that here. And rating is the default heading. I would probably recommend leaving that as such, but if you wanted to add some context to what the rating is for, feel free to do so if you'd like. Let's click OK so that we can actually see this in action. Okay, here we go. So we have this new rating column. Of course, none of these references yet have a rating applied to it, but you can see if you choose any one of these references in that rating column, we see sort of 5 dots signifying up to 5 stars. Now, you can click any one of the dots to apply that sort of 5-star rating system, like I mentioned. And the sort of the criteria related to the rating is subjective. I wouldn't say that it's, you know, that you're applying, you know, or you're tracking sort of the best quality or best written, you know, literature. I would actually say, in my personal experience speaking with EndNote users, the most common rating system I see applied is the sort of the likelihood of including a particular resource in a writing project that someone's developing. So again, each one of these entries here, you can apply sort of this rating system to, and that's retained here in your EndNote library. So that's really handy. You know, not everyone is looking to do something like this. This had been a default display column for a while, but again, since this is probably a lesser used feature, we had chosen to make that not one of the defaults in EndNote 20. But just to reiterate, at any point, if you want, if rating isn't displayed and you want that to show up, simply point your mouse over any one of the display columns, click the little gear icon here, and that'll take you right to display fields, and you can set any one of your display columns to be rating to achieve that. Now, while we're on preferences here, I wanted to talk a little bit about the reference types in EndNote. There's a separate tab on preferences for reference types. Here we see a setting related to your default reference type. If you're manually creating a new entry in your EndNote library, the default reference type is journal article. But if you're working with different types of materials more often, you can change that to be something else to save you a click. But really what we're wanting to look at here today is the modification of reference types. So from the same reference types tab, we're going to click modify reference types. We now have a table of the reference types in EndNote. Now you're only looking at one reference type at a time, and that's whatever is selected here on the reference type dropdown. We'll stay on journal article just for a moment, but we see a little bit further down here, there's sort of a, again, a table of fields. Now, on the left in the gray column, these are the, this is the generic reference type and the default fields that exist in EndNote. So when you're talking about, like, you know, fields in EndNote, these are the names of the fields for, you know, each area to, you know, enter data into an EndNote library record. On the right, in the white column, this is the specific reference type in EndNote that you're viewing and possibly modifying, and the field labels that you would wish to display. And the field labels for a particular reference type don't necessarily have to mirror the names of the fields related to the generic reference type. So we do see for journal article, you know, the author field is called author, the year field is called year, title is called title, but the secondary title field is actually called journal for journal article. And just if we read down a little bit further, we see that, you know, number of volumes is actually called part/supplement. The number field is actually called issue. And the reason for that is that, you know, all of the reference types in EndNote share these generic field names. So just to point out, if we now move over to the newspaper article reference type, just as an example, we see that what had been called the author field for a journal article is now called reporter. What had been called the journal field for a journal article is now called newspaper. So again, you can have differing labels for each of the fields for your various reference types, but they all link back to sort of a default set of generic field names related to the generic reference type. But when it comes to the individual reference types in EndNote, you can customize the field, the reference type names. You can completely change the reference type if you'd like. You can change which field labels appear. If there's a particular field you don't want to show up at all, maybe you won't have any information for that particular or rather you might have any details for that particular piece of information, you can take a field out altogether so that it doesn't even show up in your particular reference type. There are a couple of completely unused reference types available in EndNote if you want to create one from scratch. And I did just want to point out as well, if there are reference types that you'll never use, just as an example, maybe you're not going to be storing any sort of music materials in your library, and you don't even want this to show up as an available reference type, you would simply add a little period in front of the custom reference type name, and it will remain part of your EndNote preferences, but it just won't be available on the reference type dropdown. And when you're finished making your changes, you can export your reference types to an XML file that can be shared with someone else. So let's pretend we had, made maybe a brand new reference type or customized some fields, and we want to make sure that our colleagues have the same fields or reference types available when they're looking at our shared library. Let's say we can click export here. We can go ahead and pick a location to where to save this XML file. We'll just put it right on the desktop. You can give it any name, but something like EN types usually makes the most sense. And then once that's saved, it's just an individual file. If I show you here on the desktop, we can attach that to an email, put it on a network drive, share it via Google Drive, something like that. But once your Sherry has received the file, they would be able to come to EndNote preferences. Again, go to edit, select preferences here. They would go to reference types, and they could import your custom XML file so that they can have all of the same field names and reference type names. The one thing I would recommend is that if you're receiving someone else's reference types, when you import that into your copy of EndNote, it doesn't integrate in your existing customizations. If you had customized reference types in some other manner and you go and import someone else's reference types into yours, all of your previous customizations would be lost. So what I would recommend, if someone is sharing an XML file of EndNote reference types with you, go ahead and export your own first to a separate file, and then that way, if you're ever done working with your colleagues' reference types, you can simply come back here, select the import command again, and you can re-import whatever customizations you had introduced ahead of time, so that you don't have to recreate those changes from scratch. So I hope that helps. Now, just quickly here, want to talk a little bit about a couple of global edit features in EndNote. There is no undo command for a global edit in EndNote desktop. So before making any sort of global edit, I always recommend backing up your library just in case. Again, from the file dropdown, you can choose the compress command, compress library command. That'll create a snapshot of the library as it exists. But the first command we're going to take a look at is called find and replace. It's right here on the library dropdown menu. It's a pretty common program element. Usually if there's a term or phrase that exists in multiple instances that you want to update, but you don't want to do it on a case-by-case basis, find and replace can help you achieve that. So aside from like a typo in a field, a good example of using find and replace in EndNote would be to uniformly enter an author in your EndNote library. This doesn't come up so often for numbered styles, but if you're formatting with an author date style, in some cases a journal may ask that you differentiate authors that share the same surname to let your reader know that multiple citations aren't attributable to that same person. So just as an example here in our sample library, we've got several references from a researcher named Jody Daniel. And we see we've got a couple of references where the person's name is entered Daniel, Jody, but we do see one instance where it's Daniel, J period, and another where it's Daniel, space J space C. Now, in most cases, like I said, numbered styles, this really doesn't matter, but for that EndNote element, the formatting element that I described about disambiguating authors with the same surname, if we were formatting with a style set to do that, and we cite several of these references from Jody Daniel, EndNote would actually think they're different persons, attributable to different persons, because the author name has been entered in different formats. And to get EndNote to output the name consistently, we would want to replace the name in each of these cited references so that they're the same in each entry. So we could go reference by reference. We could go to the edit panel here on the reference panel. We can make the change. We're going to achieve this with that global edit. And we could apply whatever naming convention we want across the board, but because EndNote can take a full name and abbreviate it to an initial, but it can't do the opposite. It can't take an initial and output the full name. I would recommend that you take a full name format and apply that over the instances where it's just a person's initial. So I've just copied the full name here just to save some time. And what we want to do next is go to the library drop-down menu, select find and replace. In the in drop-down, we choose the field that we want to apply this change to. In this instance, it's the author field. We could put in the one of the alternate naming conventions for Jody Daniel here. I'm going to just paste in her full name first, just again to save some time, but I'm going to customize this, and we'll first replace the instance of Daniel, comma, space, J period. We'll go ahead and do one more paste and to replace with her full name again. I'm going to deselect these optional selections here. I don't think it would really matter on this particular change, but I usually, since we don't need to match words or retain capitalization, I've turned those off. And now that we've got in author, find Daniel, comma, space, J period, replace with Daniel, comma, space, Jody, we can press change. EndNote lets us know, in so many references in your library, this particular term is found in X number of references. Are you sure you want to make this change? If that looks like an accurate statement, you would press OK. You get a confirmation window, and if you press OK again, just keep an eye on this particular reference here, because we'll see, all right, we see that instead of Daniel, comma, space, J period, we see Jody Daniel's full name here. We're going to do this one more time with this other format, the two initial format. We'll just go back to library, find and replace, in author, find, we're going to put in Daniel, comma, space, J space C, and then in the replace with her full name again. And if we go ahead and press change, all right, this time, out of so many references, it was found in one. Are you sure you want to make the change? If we go and say okay, all right, we see those changes have taken effect. So all of our references from Jody Daniel all have her name in the same format. And if we were using an output style in Word that was set to differentiate authors that share the same surname, EndNote would be able to understand that these are all attributable to the same person. One more global edit that I wanted to show again was that on the library dropdown, change, move, copy fields. This is a little bit more nuanced. You're not looking for a term or phrase or a typo to fix. You're actually applying a change to multiple references at once. Now in EndNote 20, if you want to, we had made a change looking at all references in the library, but if you might want to make a subset change, you need to make sure that you're only showing those references ahead of time. So let's say for whatever reason, maybe we just captured these references here, these highlighted references from an online database, and we wanted to note that database name before proceeding. We can select the references that we want to customize in this global edit fashion. We could now go to groups, add references to, and we can create a custom group for this global edit action. I'll go and do that now. Once we've got the new group and when we've got it selected, we're now only showing these 20 references. And with this group selected, if we go to library, change, move, copy fields, the change that we apply will only impact this subset of references. So just to confirm, if you want to make a global edit in your entire library, start on all references. If you want to apply a subset change, add the references to a group and then be sure to display that group. From here, like I mentioned, you can do things like add a keyword or a note or a phrase to a field. You can replace before or after existing text. You can wipe out existing text and replace it with this new phrase. If you just want to clear a field so that it's completely empty, you can choose that option here. If you want to change capitalization in a field, you have the option to do so here. We've got about 5 different hard-coded capitalization options. But from this same screen, you can also, from move, copy fields, you can take data from one field, move it to another, or instead, you can leave the data in the originating field and just copy it to another field in your EndNote library. So let's say for our change here, if we go back to change fields, we say in, let's go ahead and say, we'll go ahead and use the label field just as an example here. In label, we can go ahead and insert, let's just say they came from Web of Science, just as an example, or maybe we'll just use WAS as the abbreviation. We can go ahead and press OK, and EndNote says, in the 20 references showing, are you sure you want to insert WOS at the end of label? This can't be undone. If we say OK here, the change is applied, and if we go and just add label as a display column quickly, All right, we see that our global edit was applied to all of these references all at once. So instead of having to go reference by reference, making our customization, we were able to do it just in one action. And I see we're just about at time. There's just one more element that I want to touch on today before we wrap. That was how to, download styles. And this is something you can get from the downloads page at EndNote.com. Individual journals sometimes will host their own custom styles. If a colleague of yours created a custom style, they can send it to you via email or, like I mentioned, network drive or sync service. But let's go and we'll look at the style repository at EndNote.com, and we're just going to go ahead and we'll use the LGBT health style that was just added a couple of weeks ago. If that was a style we're interested in, we can go ahead and press download here. It's just an individual file on our hard drive. It's a very small ENS file. It stands for EndNote style. Once that's downloaded, all we have to do is double click on the file that opens it for editing in EndNote. If we want to incorporate this in our copy of EndNote, we simply go to File, we select Save As. We need to make sure that we save it with whatever name we'd like it to exist with. So I'm just going to take the word copy off. We'll go ahead and call it LGBT Health. Press Save here. And now that's all. It's now part of our EndNote application. So if we go ahead and close that, go to Tools, Output Styles, Open Style Manager, we would be able to find it here on the Style Manager, and it's available to format with now. With that said, we are just right at time, and I just wanted to, before we close, I just wanted to point out a couple of resources from the website. If you're ever looking for EndNote learning materials, you can click the training link at endnote.com. That'll take you to the training portal where we have instructional videos, PDF guides, a link to our e-learning platform, our live training calendar. We host public sessions like this on a monthly basis for free. Feel free to sign up for those. But if you're ever looking for assistance with the software, you have a team of experts that work around the clock 24/5, Monday through Friday. You can visit the support link at endnote.com to be taken to the support portal. You could open a case via chat, email, or telephone. And again, we have a team of experts that are available around the clock to help get you back on track as quickly as possible. With that said, we don't really have time for any live questions, but Katie, if you'd like to share those in a written format afterward, I'd be happy to prepare responses, and then you can share those with the attendees of the session today, if that sounds okay.
Great. Thank you so much, Jimmy. That was so much information, and I want to thank everyone for listening in and attending today. We'll post this recording up on the library's seminars page shortly, and I want to thank you, Jimmy, for doing a wonderful job with all three of these sessions. We really appreciate it. I put the seminars link in the chat, so you'll be able to find our the recording on that library training tab. With that, yes, we only had one question, and so I will address it here. If you update EndNote on your desktop, what happens to your laptop? You also need to make sure it is updated on your laptop, because if you're syncing and sharing across that desktop computer and then that laptop, it's not going to communicate quite right if you don't have the same versions.
Yes, good advice.
Okay, thank you everyone, and I hope you have a wonderful, safe rest of your Wednesday. Take care.
Thank you. Bye-bye.